International, Argentina. It's a great pleasure to meet today with these great panelists, beloved people that I'll be introducing. We'll talk about the challenges and learnings around the implementation of abortion in Argentina and all over the world. Argentina is in a decisive moment to develop public policies for the implementation of decriminalization and legalization of abortion. In this context, it's essential to bring about dialogue internationally to learn from other countries, to look into how the different challenges were overcome in order to achieve progress, what strategies were at play to cope with the conservative onslaught. In this context, to begin with the presentation, I'd like to show you a video that captures a unique moment lived in Argentina on 29th December 2020. Can you please play the video? These images show the team of Amnesty International Argentina and the Green Wave that occupied the streets in front of the National Congress when we could celebrate the law of the voluntary interruption of pregnancy. That morning, we achieved the right to abortion. It was a great achievement in Argentina and for South America, who were expecting Argentina to go forward in the recognition of these rights. Even in a pandemic context due to COVID, in a very strict quarantine in Argentina for almost 9 months, we never stopped mobilizing for the right to abortion. The approval of the law 27610 is a starting point for the recognition of the right to abortion all over the country. It's a mixed model. It allows the access to the voluntary interruption of pregnancy without showing a motive until week 14. It keeps the access to legal abortion for causes of great risk to life or the health of women or product of rape without a time limit. 9 months after the passing of the law, there are great barriers that we've detected for the effective access. As we have seen the presentation, from its approval, there was a great number of suits to declare the law unconstitutional. We have 35 suits, out of which 19 have been rejected. The trend of rejection to the actions began shows how the judiciary is not open to these attempts to overthrow the law. But in isolation, some judges enable these attacks. In those cases, we have stood on behalf of women and other gender identities with the gestating capability. Argentina is unequal in the access to sexual and reproductive health. In many provinces, women who live in urban centers or urban areas far from the provincial capitals still cannot access abortion due to the lack of availability of these services and of a lack of personnel. There's a great need to inform and empower citizenship about the existence of the rights. And a no right cannot be exercised. and the state is not carrying out information campaigns about the right to access abortion, where to do it, how to do so, what barriers we may face. Another outstanding debt is to authorize the commercialization and production of mifepristone is an essential medicine recommended by the WHO to access to abortion. It's fundamental to be in conversation with progress and experiences in the world. That's why in these 2 days, we decided to organize this event with academicians who are committed to this topic, with activists, and especially today, we have a panel which is very familiar. We have been part of Amnesty. In the first place, I'll introduce Jaime Todd-Gher. She was part of Amnesty International. She was part of the Department of Policy in topics related to sexual and reproductive health, in what is related to abortion within the organization. Today, she's an independent consultant and law fellow at the University of Toronto in the Reproductive and Sexual Health Law Department. Tarah Demant is the Director of Gender, Sexuality and Identity Program in Amnesty USA. Colm is the Executive Director of Amnesty International Ireland. Each of them will participate and will pose some questions. Later, we'll open the last 30 minutes for audience questions. We'll be receiving questions on the YouTube chat. Jaime, I'll give you the floor and I'll present the first question. The legalization of abortion brought the strengthening of groups anti-rights and the campaign of let's save the 2 lives and no mess with my children. They are based on fear and the lack of information. They go against the rights of women and the groups LGBTIQ+. These have contributed to other attempts to hinder the implementation of this law. The legal rejection shows that the judiciary is aligned to not accepting these suits, but as I've mentioned, the anti-right groups are making their arguments more complex in order to attack these achieved rights. My first question is, what strategies, that is campaigns, advocacy, or strategic litigation, have worked out in other countries to face the attempts of the conservative onslaught?
Thank you, Mariela, and thank you to everyone who's organized this webinar. As an initial matter, I just want to say I could not be more proud of the mobilization that's occurred in Argentina and in the region around abortion. It really has given a breath of fresh air and hope to the global movement, and really stands, something to be lauded and applauded and honored. So thank you for the collective effort. But my heart is also heavy that there is a backlash happening, but I'm not surprised in the least. And what's happening now is straight out of the opposition's playbook and the approach that they take. And as Mariela mentioned, there's 35 legal actions that have been filed. Fortunately, many of them have been dismissed. But over time, the legal arguments will become more sophisticated to try and challenge this progressive law. It's very much a strategy to bring these cases that, regardless of whether they have any merits and regardless of whether they're successful, they are intended to exhaust abortion rights advocates' human and financial resources. And they're used to delay and distract from effective implementation of the law. The aims of these lawsuits are to challenge the constitutionality, to erect barriers to positive enforcement, and to try and exempt medical providers and medical institutions from complying with the law. So the question is, what can we do? as an initial matter, whenever we're engaging in progressive abortion law reform, is be prepared and anticipate this backlash and this legal fight. I think what's most important now in Argentina is to share resources, share legal briefs and strategies to both have an effective and efficient aligned response to the litigation, and also bring on pro bono counsel, partner with law firms that have resources and law schools and NGOs that are definitely in your corner and that want to help. These types of responsive briefs can be developed well in advance because we know what they're going to argue. They're going to argue unconstitutionality, violations of the right of the fetus, spousal rights, and the right to object or conscience-based refusals. And we know that colleagues and allies in Mexico and Colombia and Chile are facing the exact same fights. So be prepared. Another really important tactic is developing a communication strategy around this litigation and the backlash. If we don't do that, then the anti-rights contingent will control the narrative. And what we want to do is document publicly what's happening in the courts, even when the claims are successful or unsuccessful. When the claims are successful, you want to start building the case that the government is failing to comply with its international legal obligations to not only ensure, reform laws and policies around abortion, but actually ensure access. And so whether it be through the judiciary that these barriers are being erected or otherwise, when women, girls, and all people who can become pregnant cannot actually exercise their right to terminate their pregnancy, then the government is failing in that obligation. So you definitely want to document when these suits are effective. But even when they're ineffective, you want to show to the public what the strategy is. And you want to take a long-term approach. If one of these cases moves through the courts and it's a particularly egregious case, keep your eye on it with the long-term goal to bring it to the regional or international human rights level. While that's a very long-term strategy, it's the perfect way to promote positive norm development. And there are funders that have that long-term game in mind. So it's definitely something to keep in mind as well. And then a final point I'd like to make is campaigning for cultural change, because even when you reform the laws and policies, and even when you engage in litigation, unless and until you bring communities and the public along, this fight will continue at the level it is. There was so much immense mobilization to culminate in this positive law reform. I think it's really important to think about what connected this diverse, robust mass of people. What were the issues that brought them together? Was it seeking freedom for control over their own bodies, freedom from sex and gender stereotypes? Continue that collective engagement, look for funding to support long-term solidarity measures, because that is the type of synergy and engagement that will be necessary to engage in cultural change. One thing I really just wanted to highlight too, in terms of this cultural change work, is that we need to tackle this gender stereotype that compels cisgender women and girls in particular to bear children, and that hinges their value in society on bearing children. And anyone who rejects that mandate, whether it's through abortion or seeking to not remain pregnant, is deemed a moral failure and punished. And this gender stereotype is not simply about pregnancy and abortion, but it also limits access to education, employment, inheritance, and property ownership. So this is an underlying stereotype that fuels all of these restrictions and backlash So that could be one rallying cry for this collective mobilization, is how will we tackle this together? And I think that's an important step in terms of, pushing back against this backlash. In terms of successful, pushback against this type of mobilization, we have the Irish referendum, which my colleague Colm will speak to, no doubt. We have all of the amazing advocacy and litigation taking place in Mexico that has achieved progressive law reform in that country. And we have coalition work that is coming around reproductive justice concepts and that are making alliances where they were not made before in UN circles and at the regional level that we can all draw from. So I think there's an energy, and this is a moment that we need to capitalize on in Argentina. And you can trust that the people around the world are watching and ready to support. So I just throw that back to this group as a point of encouragement and just an applause again for this amazing work. So thank you.
Gracias, Jaime. Súper interesante, la verdad.
Thank you, Jaime. Extremely interesting. We'll take up some of your reflections more deeply later. We are seeing in Amnesty that the trans-feminist movements have claimed models to decriminalize abortion, to go towards the recognition of what is called reproductive autonomy from a more intersectional perspective. What do we mean by reproductive justice, and what are the opportunities at the international level to go towards this goal?
Shall I answer that question now, or?
Yes, sure.
Yes, okay, thank you. So the concept of reproductive justice, as I presume many people on this webinar know, is trying to move us out of this siloed focus on abortion and terminating pregnancy to consider the broader community, social, and structural factors that actually impede reproductive and bodily autonomy. And when we apply a reproductive justice framework, we're considering the broader individual, community, and state-sanctioned oppression that is operating in our lives and constraining our ability to live the lives that we want. It's really about enabling us to create and nurture the families we choose and achieve the optimal mental, physical, community, and economic health that we strive for. And what is really amazing about the reproductive justice lens and framework is that it specifically focuses on those with marginalized identities, those who face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, and those who are most constrained by laws, policies, and social and cultural norms. This tends to be people who face racial and ethnic discrimination, people with disabilities, LGBTIQ individuals, and those who face criminalization and punitive regulation more broadly. So opportunities to advance a reproductive justice framework and approach at the international level is really important, because it's trying to refocus to structural discrimination and oppression and redistribute resources and power. And this is not always the language that it's not necessarily the language you find in treaties or in the early years of treaty body interpretations and in international litigation, but that language and that framing is emerging, and there is an appetite for it. How do we do this? And how do we understand when we are already engaging in reproductive justice work is thinking about how do we tie sexual and reproductive rights issues to economic and social rights issues, to universal access to healthcare, to access to education and employment. And so when we connect these issues, the issues that create barriers to our ability to access contraception, comprehensive sexuality education, prenatal care, living wages, supportive workplace policies, and intimate partner violence. When we show that and tackle these broader issues, then we are working towards reproductive justice. And when we commit to taking intersectional approaches, which is also a very core component of a reproductive justice approach, we're prioritizing and considering the realities of people with multiple marginalized and oppressed identities. Other examples may include, forging partnerships with allies who are working on racial discrimination, disability rights, environmental rights, and Indigenous peoples' rights. In all of that work, there is a slice of the work that should be also focusing on how does that impact sexual and reproductive health, sexual autonomy, and bodily autonomy. Another way to take up a reproductive justice approach is starting to think about infertility. This is an emerging human rights issue that's finally gaining some traction, both by anti-rights advocates and by progressive sexual and reproductive rights and justice advocates. It's the other side of the spectrum. It's not only enabling people to control their bodies and prevent pregnancy, but working towards enabling people to bear children and create the families that they seek. Because at present, there are very restrictive laws and policies that prioritizes the reproduction of some, while deprioritizes and limits the reproduction of others. And so similar to a reproductive justice lens, when you apply an infertility lens to your work, the intersections of gender, racial, and other forms of discrimination, disability discrimination, it all becomes more clear. Another way to ensure you're taking a reproductive justice approach is to make sure that your work is not reinforcing a gender binary and give space and attention to those who challenge the binary, who live both in the margins and in the gray of gender, or who reject the concept of gender entirely. I continue to do work on sex work and those who are criminalized for utilizing their sexuality for work, those who advocate for sexual pleasure, and sex for non-reproductive means is another way to do important reproductive justice work. Before I end, I just want to highlight that, again, this reproductive justice framing and discussion is really strengthening at the international level. I mean, just recently we have the recent report by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health that focuses on sexual and reproductive rights and challenges in the context of COVID, the pandemic. And while she does not necessarily call it reproductive justice, it's very much a reproductive justice report. She applies an intersectionality framework. She considers the impact of colonialism and structural inequalities on sexual and reproductive health. And I highly recommend engaging directly with this UN special procedure, as she's probably the most friendly and embracing of reproductive justice values of any special procedure to date. Another report, and I'll add links in the comment box with these reports, is the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. They released a report recently in April, I believe, that focuses on sexual and reproductive health and rights in crisis. And again, it doesn't necessarily call itself a reproductive justice report, but it's very much one that focuses on how gender inequality manifests as systemic disadvantages for women and girls and people throughout their life course. And that in and of itself is a crisis. And it tackles issues of patriarchy and colonial and racial and legal policy frameworks and institutions that essentially gives governments a pass in meeting their international legal obligations around sexual and reproductive health. And finally, I wanted to raise the profile of a US focused report, the Black Reproductive Justice Policy Agenda report, that while it is US focused, it is extremely useful in terms of conceptualizing reproductive justice approaches. It focuses on the right to not have a child, the right to have a child, the right to social and economic supports to parent the children we have, free from violence, and the right to sexual expression and sexual pleasure. And I just wanted to quickly quote one of the authors of the report. As reproductive justice advocates, we approach this work rooted in the human right to control our bodies, our sexuality, our gender, our work, our sexual pleasure, and our reproduction, as well as our belief that this right can only be achieved when all women, femmes, girls, and gender expansive individuals have the complete economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions in all areas of our lives, including our bodies, our families, and our communities. To me, that right there is a rally cry. And reproductive justice work is not easy. It's controversial, but it's immensely important, and it's the path to liberation. And I think that the work that's happening in Argentina is part of this work. So let's continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaime. I already have, Spanish. Gracias, Jaime.
Thank you, Jaime. I have several questions already from the audience for you, but we'll save those for the end, if you don't mind, because now we want to move on with Tarah. Tarah, we were concerned, and we are very concerned about the situation in the US. There's progressively a worsening situation in the right to access to safe abortion. The most recent example is the Texas abortion ban. It is one of the many examples that shows that our states are taking a step back against reproductive rights. And just recently, the Supreme Court about that case in December that also directly challenges the right to abortion. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, the Northern Hemisphere led the efforts. On 1973, the Supreme Court ruling of the US in the Roe versus Wade case, the United States recognized the right to abortion. But now it's the trans feminist movements in Latin America that are advancing in the discussion to put reproductive autonomy and gender justice at the center of the scene. So what place does the US occupy today on the gender and reproductive and sexual health agenda? What advances in the region are made in the dialogue? And from the approval of the act in Argentina, or what happened in Mexico, yesterday in Chile, how does that reflect in the US? How is that felt in the US?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mariela, and everyone. And I would just echo what Jaime had said, first of all, which is how important the movement, particularly in Argentina, has been and continues to be, and the visibility of that movement, really that is the trans feminist movement that's leading the way in Central and South America now. And that matters a great deal to the work that we're doing here, specifically in the United States, and I know around the world. So thank you, and thank you all who are listening in on to this panel, and of course all the folks who have helped put this together. So I'd start by saying I think there was, and some of our colleagues internationally were quite surprised when the Texas abortion ban was allowed by the Supreme Court to go through. And reproductive rights and justice advocates in the United States were not surprised at all. Since 1973, when Roe v. Wade was ruled on by the Supreme Court, that's what gives the right to legal abortion in the United States up to viability. that since that very moment, there has been extremely organized and well-funded opposition to sexual and reproductive health and rights. And that agenda, we're seeing the sort of fruits of that agenda now. And it certainly predates Roe, but it's something that we've seen, the immediate challenges to Roe versus Wade, which really was the bottom of what we need in terms of access to abortion, not the ceiling, and that we've seen challenges to that over and over and over again. So while Roe made abortion legal in theory, in reality, access to abortion has been extremely limited across the United States for a long time. So there's been this narrative of rights that the United States uses in lots of international spaces and in lots of its own domestic spaces, and rights and freedom, when the reality is that that's really never been the case on the ground for women and people who can get pregnant. There's multiple states have rolled back rights at the state level since 1973. And this is just the latest challenge, right? Some of those laws have been direct abortion bans. And what makes this different, this Texas law different, is that it is the first ban that's been allowed to go into effect, which is extremely alarming. And that is extremely alarming. But before that, we had limits on spending, US spending, and who could access abortion. So things like the Hyde Amendment, which said that no public funding could go to abortion care. So that means anybody who depends on any public funding, which would be low-income people or Indigenous people, for example, who use Indian health services, don't have access to abortion. So there's been this increasing chasm in the United States between the rhetoric of rights and freedom and the reality on the ground, even including around abortion and abortion care. So I think that's an important lesson that we have not taken as well here, that is to think about in terms of the global movement, which is how we talk about rights as opposed to access. And that's one of those questions between a rights-based framework and a reproductive justice-based framework. And the movement in the transfeminist movement in Latin and South America, and really, specifically in Argentina, it's really hard to overstate how important it is to see that continued progression happening for the work that's happening in the United States. There has been this idea that we'd continue to sort of move upward and continue to sort of move forward in a rights-based space. But of course, what we're seeing is the opposite. And as you mentioned, in December, our Supreme Court will hear a direct challenge to Roe versus Wade, which is an abortion ban that was very similar to Texas, that went through Mississippi, but at the time was blocked. And the arguments will be made that ultimately that the federal government should not allow, protect the right to abortion, that should be allowed by the states to do, or to do as they please. And what we're likely to see is then a real abortion access desert and a care desert in which certain states or certain regions might have better access, and then you'll be in places where there's just no access at all. So that framework around rights has not served us well in a lot of ways, I think, when we haven't seen those intersections on the types of challenges that are happening from the conservative right that aren't simply about abortion. They're about who controls their body, who can make choices about their lives and their dignity, who can live in dignity in as non-cisgender, non-heterosexual people, because these challenges to our rights and abortion care are directly linked to the challenges that are happening at the United States against trans kids, or against access to equality under the law for LGBTQI plus people. So those things go hand in hand. And I think one of the important lessons that Jaime mentioned, and that we take from also the transfeminist movement in the Americas, is seeing those as the same fight, and that's the future that we need to build. Because when we separate those things out, we become extremely vulnerable and sort of picked off one by one, as opposed to being a strengthening force. So I think, globally, I think what we're seeing is that the United States, which has been seen as a leader in certain aspects, one really never was. But certainly now, as we see the leadership of the movements in the Americas rising, that's a lesson for us to take. And that's a really important lesson for us to take globally in all our human rights work, is that what makes the movement in Argentina so powerful, particularly at an international level and its visibility, is how people-centered it is. because you have in the United States, the overwhelming majority of Americans in the US support the right to abortion, the overwhelming majority. So we're looking at things that are, generally agreed upon, but you have decision makers who have particular political interest in pushing a certain narrative. So showing that mass amount of people power, like we can't depend on specific laws and codes. And I think another mistake in the US movement has been, particularly around abortion rights, has been using Roe versus Wade as the assumption that this would save us and save our rights, when really this was always just the beginning, and we always needed more, because Roe is not really expansive. It's not a reproductive justice framework, right? It was a really limited framework that at the very least allowed for abortion up to viability, which is around 24 weeks without interference from the state. And that should never have been enough. And it never has been enough. And it's really the people power that's going to get us, because now that we have in the United States a much more conservative court, we can't depend on the courts. And we have been until now depending on the courts. So part of that lesson that I take from the movement, the movement in the Americas, and that I think is one to give back, is around the multifaceted way we have to look at this, and looking, as Jaime said, as many approaches to ensuring the security of our rights and reproductive justice as we can. And of course, like using the one that you have the most amount of time and viability to achieve, but ultimately it has to be a full community change, because if we just get that one law, there's always going to be backlash. There's always going to be people waiting immediately to strip back rights. So we have to make a full community change. And that takes a lot more people power than simply, and it's never simple, but simply passing a law or simply getting a referendum to happen. And those things have been immensely important because they were driven by people power, right? The law itself, of course, matters. Of course, the referendum matters. And what makes that matter is the massive amount of people power that went into making that happen. And those are important lessons that, the abortion rights and reproductive justice movement in the United States are increasingly visibly people powered. And there has been two sort of conversations around that. And some of it has been in this, like the policy world and the legal world. And then the folks on the ground who are really making sure people can access abortion care, who are really making sure that someone gets the reproductive justice that they need, whatever that looks like, and that those need to come together, because that's where we're strongest. So those are really critical lessons, I think, that we take from the transfeminist movement, and really understanding those intersections. And it's complicated because, you only have so much time, and you only have so much money, and you only have so much effort that you can give. So you think, okay, we're going to really focus and have a really strategic goal. But when we do that, we've really missed the point, and we've missed the power of harnessing that movement.
Gracias, Tara. La verdad es que mientras hablabas pensaba, ¿no? Que uno a veces...
While you were speaking, I was thinking, well, the US is a model, and in fact, you have the same issues to face that we come up against. What is going on at the political level and the enforcement itself. In this context that you were describing, what is the impact that the gag rule has had that has been overruled nowadays, but it didn't provide funding for those who provide information on abortion? Why is it important to promote what is called the Global Her Act?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you asked about that, Mariela, to make those connections. So for folks who may not know, the Global Gag Rule is a US foreign policy that restricts US aid to any country or hospital or clinic that uses their own money to so much as educate their population on safe abortion, but nonetheless, of course, provide safe abortion care. So what this effectively is the United States abortion ban that we export around the world to anyone who receives US aid. And that could be for, PEPFAR aid for AIDS and HIV prevention. It could be for maternal health. It could be for food programs. If you receive any US aid, you can't even talk about where someone can get a safe abortion. And we know what the impact is. It's a rise in maternal. It's not a decrease in abortion. It's an increase in abortion rates. It's an increase in unsafe abortion rates specifically. And it's also an increase in preventable maternal death. It's also an increase in disruptions of healthcare and higher morbidity, in longer and extremely cyclical poverty rates. And one of the things that I think is so important about connecting both the national work at the United States and the international is, in many cases on many topics, but certainly on this, that the United States sort of, talks out of both sides of its face, where on the one hand, we're talking about human rights. And in the United States, it's like, well, you have this right to abortion under these circumstances. Well, the other, we're totally denying that, de facto denying that to folks who are receiving US aid in some way. The trick has been making folks, I think, at the national level, again, who are extremely exhausted, as you all know, we're all very exhausted, and at the international level, who are extremely exhausted, that to see these as the same thing, that even if we had the best access and rights to abortion in the United States, which we don't, that somehow that's different than funding problems that mean that there is an abortion ban in wherever our US aid goes, which is a lot of places. And those are the same fight. Those are the exact same fight. The Global HER Act is a bill that would permanently repeal the global gag rule. Every Republican president, which is our right conservative party since Ronald Reagan in the 80s, has implemented the global gag rule. Every Democratic president, which is our more leftist party, has repealed it. So right now, the global gag rule is repealed under President Biden, but future presidents can and will reinstate this, interrupting healthcare, raising morbidity rates, violating rights on every number of levels. And those two separate issues of national access to abortion and funding restrictions that create abortion bans are the same issue. And the opposition knows that they are the same issue, because the opposition has been using this to restrict people's rights wherever they can. And the motivations are manyfold, right? But there's political power in the United States in this narrative of restricting rights. And that's something we need to think about. And there's a narrative around certain traditional conservative values. And so when they can't be enforced at the national level, which again, they can in many ways, then we enforce them internationally. And those are the same fight. And we have to see that as folks in the United States and also transcontinentally and across our movement, as that we are fighting for the same thing, which is the ability of people to live with dignity, to control their bodies, to choose whether and when to have children, and to be able to access the full spectrum of their human rights. And if we don't see them as connected, we are all going to lose at some point. We're going to get picked off as we're going. And that's what we're seeing in the United States, as was something we thought was very secure, but there have been versions of it picked off, right? First, it was like, well, really poor, like rural folks or poorer folks, low income or minority folks don't have the same access, but oh, well, at least we have this law, right? But that has been part of that strategy is picking off these things so that eventually we're all going to fall. And you might say in English, all the dominoes will fall in the game, because it is the same fight. So we have to see those things together, and we have to be working together on those things. And it's a challenge because there is limited resources, there is limited time and money, and there's limited political will. And what our job is to help people see those as connected and to create that political will, so that as we work to protect abortion access and reproductive rights in the United States, we are also working to do that with the US influence abroad, in this case through its funding.
Gracias, Tarah.
Thank you, Tarah. I have some questions for you that I'll pose later. Maybe one of the questions that some people present is, how do you think the right to safe and legal abortion has impacted, the right to abortion in Argentina and Mexico has impacted on the USA? Now we'll continue with Colm. The recognition to the right to abortion in Ireland was a key antecedent to the approval of the law in Argentina. In Amnesty, we see it as a point that has contributed enormously due to the international pressure that it achieved in order to recognize reproductive autonomy. Even so, women and people with gestating capabilities still face barriers to access a safe abortion in the health system. Comparative experiences are valuable to anticipate possible resistances and opportunities. 3 years have gone by from the historical referendum that put an end to the banning of abortion in Ireland. Colm, what has changed positively and what are the present challenges?
Thanks very much, Mariela, and it's wonderful to see everybody this evening, and fantastic as always to follow on from Jaime and Tarah. They've set my mind racing and my heart pumping as I've listened, and above all, what it reminds me is that this really is, you know, a global common battle that we're involved in, and that the connections that we make with each other and the solidarity that we show is critical to achieving the successes that we've achieved in Ireland or indeed in Argentina. If I was in my office, which I'm not because our office is still closed because of the pandemic, I'd be wearing my green Amnesty Argentina bandana right now. And I know for us here in Ireland, the solidarity that we got from colleagues in Argentina, in the United States and across the world was hugely important. But also I think that beyond even Amnesty in Ireland, there was a recognition that we were fighting this battle not just for rights for people here in Ireland, but this was a really important global moment. Now, I don't mean that that was why people voted in the way that they voted. People voted in the way that they voted because they strongly objected to Ireland's deeply restrictive laws on abortion. And that was very, very clear. And that opposition had existed for a long time, but sadly, people hadn't been afforded the opportunity to voice that view for many years because our political system didn't allow it. And because the debate on abortion was so artificially inflamed that people did not feel able to talk about it, actually. You know, what we found in this referendum was that our exit polls, for instance, told us that most people hadn't changed their position on abortion in more than 5 years. That 80% of people knew how they were going to vote before the referendum was called. That the desire for change was long-standing and deep-seated. And remember, the referendum passed by over a 2/3 majority, which was a huge margin. So yes, it was a huge moment. And yes, it was 3 years ago. And actually, last Saturday was the first occasion for Amnesty Ireland that we participated in a public event following on from the pandemic, because public restrictions have been quite significant here and they've just been lifted recently. And it was at the annual March for Choice, the 10th March for Choice, that was organised by the Abortion Rights Campaign, a phenomenal grassroots organisation here who've been at the heart of the fight for reproductive justice in Ireland. And at that, we were talking about what still has to be secured. But you ask what's positively changed. Well, first and foremost, over 13,000 people and women have had abortion care in Ireland since the law was introduced at the beginning of 2019. It took about a year for the law to be introduced. Remarkably, services were established really out of nothing within a year. There was no abortion care being provided in Ireland. And national services were up and running in a year. I mean, prior to the new law being introduced in 2019, the only grounds where abortion was permitted was where there was a risk to life. And even then, abortion was difficult to secure. So having a new national service up and running within a year was extraordinary. And I do need to name in particular our colleagues at the Irish Family Planning Association, who for years had worked to provide services, reproductive health services to people here in Ireland, and who really stepped up and started to deliver services through their clinics too. But also services are being delivered at the GP level. So they're being delivered in general practice by family doctors and in hospitals. There's really good quality information from government, from the Government Health Service, on how to get abortion. And that's a remarkable thing. It seems such an odd thing to celebrate, doesn't it? That people can access information about healthcare, right? But we know that that's the biggest barrier that so many people face to accessing abortion, even where abortion is legal. And in Ireland, up until the referendum, providing information about access to abortion was a criminal offence too. Now we have a situation where very quickly, once the new law was enacted, there was a really, really good quality information from government health services about how to access information. The pandemic has also led to some positive changes actually in abortion care in Ireland. COVID led to a change in the care model. The law, when it was introduced in Ireland, for no good medical reason and absolutely contrary to human rights principles, introduced a mandatory 3-day waiting period. That would have required for any person to have 2 in-person doctor's visits 3 days apart before they were granted medical abortion. But the pandemic meant that telemedicine was introduced. And in most cases now, there's no visit to a doctor required to access medical abortion. It would only be if the doctor felt it was medically necessary that an in-person appointment would be needed. Lobbying from NGOs and from health professionals led the Minister for Health to commit to keeping this care model. So telemedicine is now the model for medical abortion as well. And that's obviously hugely welcome. Critically, women have been decriminalized. People who have abortions are no longer criminalized in Ireland. Those of you who were very involved, and there are many people who were very involved in our campaign, know that the Amnesty report on abortion in Ireland that set out the range of violations that women and girls and pregnant people experienced was called "She is Not a Criminal." And we focused in on criminalization as a key issue because most people actually didn't realize that was the case. So prior to the new legislation, women were still criminalized. And then another significant positive change is that there's an awful lot less stigma and change. Abortion is increasingly normalized and accepted as healthcare, accepted for what it is. And I really do have to pay tribute here to, and anybody who's been involved in campaigns of this kind knows this, that it is by people whose rights have been violated, the very people who've been brutalized by our societies, stepping up and telling their stories for no personal gain, for no personal benefit, and revealing their trauma in an incredibly generous and altruistic way that's really critical to securing change. That's bruising, that's traumatic, it's a horror. It's a horror that's necessary, but sadly too often it is necessary. But I think one of the things that we've seen as a result of that telling of stories, that humanizing of the experience of women and girls and pregnant people here in Ireland, is that really there is significantly less stigma and shame around the issue. You asked then what remains wrong. Well, sadly, there are very significant gaps in the law, and it means that there's still people falling through the cracks. The reality is that women and girls and pregnant people are still having to leave Ireland and access abortion care in other jurisdictions, particularly in the case of severe fetal abnormalities. The law only allows access up until 12 weeks on the basis of choice. After 12 weeks, there's restricted access on grounds of fatal fetal abnormality, cases of rape or incest, or where there's a serious risk to the health of the woman. And in the case of fatal fetal abnormality, the law is particularly cruel here, because what it does is it puts in place a 28-day limit. In other words, the medic who performs the procedure has to attest that the fetus would not survive more than 28 days after birth. And that's the definition provided for a fatal fetal abnormality. And that, coupled with the fact that doctors are still criminalized, providers are still criminalized if they provide abortion outside of the law and face a 14-year prison sentence, means that in many, many cases where a fetal abnormality will be fatal or will be life-limiting, if a doctor can't assert that will definitely, that the baby or the fetus will die within 28 days of delivery, then they can provide abortion care. And again, in cases of severe fetal impairment, there is absolutely no access to abortion care in Ireland. So that's an incredibly significant and cruel gap in the law. And we know that people are still traveling following fairly devastating diagnoses of severe fetal abnormalities here in Ireland. And they're still dependent upon charities and organizations like the Abortion Support Network in the UK to provide access. So it's an enormous gap. People are still traveling as well due to the 12-week limit on early access with giving reasons. We don't know how many people are traveling due to health risks. Again, the health threshold or the lack of clarity on that certainly is likely to result in a number of people still having to travel to access abortion care after 12 weeks. So that's a significant issue. Women over 9 weeks gestation then are required to attend hospitals to access abortion care. They can't do so via their general practitioner. And in much of the country, in a number of regions of the country, there's no local hospital provider for GPs to refer people to. So access locally is still a significant challenge for an awful lot of people. There is inconsistent availability of services around the country. Only 10 out of 19 hospitals with maternity units here are providing abortion. And we believe that conscience-based refusal is likely to be an issue in some cases, but there's also an issue around hospitals being under-equipped in staffing and resources. And we know that training is still an issue, even 2 years after the law was introduced. 2/3 of general practitioners are not providing abortion. Again, conscience-based refusal will be an issue to some degree there. But there are groups of phenomenal doctors, like START doctors. They're a group of healthcare providers who helped to design the general practitioner model. They were also very strong advocates for women's reproductive healthcare for many years here in Ireland. And they helped to get the service off the ground. But they also say that for many GPs are struggling and straining under existing patient loads and not having enough resources, lack of training, not enough time to engage with patients with the model as it's there again. And as I mentioned a moment ago, for medical professionals, for anybody who provides abortion, it remains criminalized beyond the confines of the legislation that was introduced in 2019. So there continues to be a chilling effect then in how the law is being interpreted, and that will undoubtedly create problems. As good as the public information has been then, the public health system information has been, information on how to access abortion can still be difficult. We still have people who run rogue agencies. They're very active online. So if somebody Googles access to abortion care here in Ireland, they're very likely to get hit by lots of ads for rogue pregnancy agencies that are effectively anti-choice organizations who try to block people's access to abortion. And there is also inconsistency in the quality of care. I'll get to that in a moment. And then finally, one of the commitments that was made after the referendum was to create safe zones. So exclusion zones that would not allow protests close to clinics or providers of abortion care. That has not been introduced as yet. And whilst commitments have been made recently that it will be introduced, it has not happened yet. And we are seeing protests outside GPs clinics, outside doctors clinics, and outside care providers. And that's a significant issue. And then on consistency of care, just recently, the Abortion Rights Campaign conducted a piece of extensive online research, and they published this last week. And some of their findings are fairly stark. 1 in 5 respondents were refused abortion care on request and were not referred to another provider, despite onward referral being required by the law. So doctors are required to onward refer, even if they conscientiously object, and yet 1 in 5 respondents were refused abortion care on request. Respondents who accessed abortion care before 10 weeks with their GPs generally reported very positive experiences, but those who accessed abortion care after 10 weeks through maternity hospitals reported overwhelmingly negative experiences, including problems with scans and facilities, and also negative attitudes of hospital staff. One respondent, for instance, spoke about how the doctor in the hospital refused to provide her with prescribed medication until she told her how much she disagreed with her decision and how bad and wrong abortion was, and that she had opposed the introduction of abortion in Ireland. So just over 20%, 22% of respondents felt that they weren't treated with dignity and respect by providers, with some experiencing racism and judgment from staff, which really speaks again to Jaime's point about the importance of intersectional approaches to understanding access to abortion care. So, you know, in effect, 3 years on from the referendum and 2 years on from the introduction of the legislation, women are experiencing some of the same human rights violations, so cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment, violations of the right to privacy, information, etc., as in our report, but significantly fewer of them. So there's been a lot of progress. The referendum was a huge moment. The introduction of the law following on from the referendum was an enormous moment. The beginning of access to abortion care locally was huge, but there are very significant gaps, and we had flagged those gaps in advance of the introduction of the legislation. And now as we head into a review of the legislation, which we sought at the time of its enactment, there'll need to be quite a lot of work to make sure that that review highlights those gaps and makes strong recommendations for how they need to be addressed.
Súper interesante, Colm. Me parece que para nosotros en Argentina todo lo que vos estás diciendo.
That's very interesting. Everything you say from Argentina, we see it as what comes next to us. So we use it to get ready. So what you say, it's your reality. We see it coming, you know. But I have another question for you, a very brief one. You said the government was good in generating and providing information on abortion. Can you be more specific on that? How did they do that? How did the government share that information? Did they use a specific channel? Were there campaigns on TV or radio? How did the government make information public?
Yeah, they ran a very specific public information campaign across multiple channels. So both on social media, through press work, in radio, and I believe on TV, but I'm not completely certain about the TV piece. And what was critical about it was very positively framed. So it spoke about access to abortion in healthcare terms, and it signposted people to telephone numbers and information numbers where people could get information about access. So it was very clear, it was very positively framed, and it pointed people to good, clear information about access to abortion care. Yeah, so it was an excellent campaign, not least because, as I said, you know, before the law was changed, it was a criminal offense to provide information about abortion in this country.
Bien, y última pregunta que teníamos pensada para hacerte era...
Last question for you. You know, Ireland enshrined the right to abortion 3 years ago, as you said, and Amnesty International is promoting a review process that seeks to identify legal loopholes and barriers that in practice prevent the exercise of sexual and reproductive rights. From Argentina, we wonder, we want to learn from your experience and lessons learned. So what highlights could you share beyond what you have already shared? I mean, if you had to share 3 key lessons learned, like a take-home message, something to be careful with, what would you suggest?
First of all, ensuring that there's a review clause in the legislation is critical, because particularly when legislation is introduced for the first time, there will be gaps. You can work really hard to avoid them, and we did, and we avoided some, but others, unfortunately, like the 3-day waiting period, this was a political sop to try to shore up support for some politicians, right? It wasn't even particularly popular, and it didn't come out of either the Citizens' Assembly, which was the deliberative forum that was put in place of citizens to make recommendations, or from the parliamentary committee that made recommendations. It wasn't included in those original recommendations. So a review period is critical. But then even once you get the review, it's really important to remember that we understand what the gaps are. And as everything moves on and as services begin to be provided, you know, we'll see those gaps play out. But the media focus shifts and moves, and political focus shifts and moves. And the public will be inclined to believe that everything is okay because we had our big victory, we had our big moment. So it's really, really important to keep a strong focus on the gaps and to keep reminding people of the gaps. And that piece about politics moving on is very significant from our perspective. You know, we had a number of real champions on this issue within our parliament. Not all of them are there anymore. Some of them are no longer in parliament. Some of them, frankly, have moved on to other issues and are less engaged on this one now than they were. And, you know, we have concerns that even with good recommendations from a review, those are just recommendations from a review. They then have to go to Parliament. If there are to be changes to the law, that has to happen through a legislative process. And we are very alert to the fact that there will be efforts made to try and push back on the 2019 legislation, and not just to prevent us from plugging some of those gaps, but there'll be attempts to push back and to roll back on access in some ways in that as well. So the battle doesn't end, frankly. And as much as we can celebrate the fact that so many fewer women and pregnant people are experiencing really grave human rights violations here in Ireland, the fact is some still are. And we have to keep reminding people of that. And you know, it's something that Tarah had said earlier, and Jaime as well had referenced. You know, I'm really remembering what Tarah said about this view that, well, you know, most people are okay. You know, generally speaking, middle class, wealthy, privileged people are doing okay and can access abortion. That was always the case, right? Generally speaking, they could travel. Now, that didn't mean that they weren't experiencing violations. Of course they were, but not to the extent that migrant women, you know, people with disabilities, trans people, intersex people, not to the same extent that other people might have experienced. So it's to make sure that all the way through our campaigning, we center those experiences, and critically that we build alliances across communities. Because, you know, Jaime, I think, said earlier on that reproductive justice work is not easy. And I think that's exactly why it's terribly important that Amnesty stays engaged on this, because it's our job to do the hard work. You know, we have the institutional heft and the authority, and frankly, as much as sometimes we are challenged with resources, we have the resources as a global movement that others don't have. So it's critically important that we partner, you know, respectfully and appropriately with other organizations and other communities, and keep doing this work.
Gracias, Colm. No puedo estar más de acuerdo con tu última reflexión.
Thanks, Colm. I totally agree. We are coming close to our closing time, and it's really late for Colm. So I have a question from Jaime, a question from the audience for each one of you. Jaime, with regards to the policy of Amnesty International, I'm reading from my cell phone. What were the most controversial points in updating abortion policy in Amnesty? For example, the temporary framework for access to abortion, and what impact has the new policy had?
Thanks, Mariela, and thanks to the audience for this important question. I think updating Amnesty International's abortion policy was pivotal to Amnesty becoming the strongest partner and ally in this movement. And Colm was just talking about, you know, we have this obligation, we have the resources, or I'm saying we as if I'm with Amnesty, but I'm still with Amnesty. The organization does have the obligation to be a backbone and support for this type of work around the world. And with its past policy, it couldn't do that. And to some extent, it was holding back movements that were seeking progressive law reform that was human rights inspired, because if Amnesty didn't agree on the advocacy points, the governments listened. So that was I think that's a huge impact, that now Amnesty International is better placed to support local and regional movements. In terms of difficult aspects, I mean, it's abortion, so it's complex, and stirs up emotion, and people often react from that sense of either personal experience or from some harm that they faced, or an emotional reaction, as opposed to also we have to stay grounded in international law and standards, because Amnesty International is an international human rights organization promoting international law and human rights standards, and really pulling people to the table to understand that you don't have to agree with this. You don't need to make this decision, but we cannot stand in the way of others who have the right to decide for themselves. And so I think there was just a lot of interpersonal work, patience with, values clarification type exercises. And then in terms of the position on time limits, which is very nuanced in that policy. While I would say gestational limits and time limits are complex and very difficult to talk about and to address, it is one of the foremost issues to address, because until we move beyond this this grounds-based approach, this gestational limit approach, we will continue to have laws and policies that discriminate. We will continue to provide the fodder for anti-rights groups to say that you're engaging in disability rights discrimination when you want to have an abortion on grounds of fetal impairment. Until we look beyond these issue-based grounds for abortion, we will continue to be divided and to some extent, in moments, enshrine discriminatory laws and policies. So from my perspective, it's a really difficult issue, and I think that the organization probably isn't perfect in how it has addressed it, but it has attempted to deal with it in an effective way and to create a strategy for how to address these questions. As a movement, I think that we need to develop greater solidarity around that very question. Thanks.
Thank you, Jaime. For Tarah now, para Tarah. Tarah, ¿qué rol podemos jugar los movimientos?
Now, Tarah, feminist movements and human rights movements worldwide, what role do they play in exercising political pressure in the US?
Yeah, it's a tremendously interesting question. I think there's a number of roles. The first is that for those who are working within the US context and reproductive justice advocates and abortion rights advocates, the role of the international feminist movement is huge. It's really hard to understate how important it is to know that you're connected to a global movement of people who are doing this work, who are carrying the baton in the race, because it's really, really tiring work and it's really discouraging work. And it is when you lose, as we are going to, in the short term, you have to remember that we will win in the long term, and seeing folks do that long-term work. And I think here in Argentina is such an important example where, there are short-term losses that are devastating, but that you build and build so that you can win in the future. And I that's a huge and important lesson for us here, and seeing that long-term fight. I think it's really important too for the advocates and policymakers to see this as a global question and to pull it out of a question of American exceptionalism, which doesn't certainly serve the globe, and it doesn't serve Americans in the end. It doesn't serve people who need their rights here in the United States. And that connection is really, really important. There's a third and complicated value, I think, as well too, which is it is important to policymakers in the United States that they see how out of step this movement backwards, this retrogression is, and how out of step it is with the rest of the world. in a bad way, that this is an exceptionalism in a very bad way. And that is really, really critical. So that again, when you see the people power of the movement, of the feminist movements, particularly in Latin America, but globally in terms of abortion rights and reproductive justice, like it's really energizing for people fighting here in the United States. And it's a really important reminder for decision makers that like the world is moving forward on this. And this is not the time for the United States to move backwards. And if you do move backwards, like you are totally out of step with what's happening, international agreements and international progression. And that's really important. And, you know, that happens in terms of like multilateral spaces and the UN and member council and that type of thing. But ultimately, like those can have a limited impact in the United States politics space, as you might imagine. But seeing the sort of global push of people, right? Not just at the UN, but like people all over the world, the news reporting on these movements and seeing the work that's happening, that's really, really impactful. So it's also something personally, it's really important to remember that like we are part of a global fight and a global movement, and we are part of a global celebration of moving forward, and that will continue to carry each other through this. So it's really, really important. It's hard to overstate how important it is.
Gracias, Tarah. Bueno, y la última pregunta
Thank you, Tarah. And the last question for Colm. What do you think was the international role that the referendum had? Did international pressure help in the referendum results, or was it just a local domestic matter?
I think international pressure and international solidarity and work at the international level was critical to securing the referendum. So I think without that, we wouldn't have secured the referendum. But I think that people's vote in the referendum was a deeply personal vote. And, you know, all the way through, one of the things that we did early in our campaign was we carried out extensive public polling because we wanted to understand where public opinion was at. We wanted to understand what did people not just think about, not how might they vote in a referendum, but what did they actually think about abortion? Did they understand Irish law? Did they agree with the law as it was framed? Did they understand that an amendment to the Constitution would be necessary? But also what informed their views and positions, etc. And what that showed us very early on was that actually the vast majority of people in the country, across all demographics, young and old, urban, rural, and all socioeconomic groups, wanted change that required the repeal of the Eighth Amendment that was put in the Irish Constitution in 1983. And the kind of polling results that we were seeing were very much reflected in the referendum result. I would, in particular, I think, point at international treaty monitoring bodies as really critical to that effort. So, you know, cases taken to the Human Rights Council, the recommendation secured from CEDAW, from Ireland's UPR process, all of these moments were really, really important moments to put the spotlight on Ireland and to put the spotlight on government, and that mattered. That actually mattered, not from an ego perspective, but that kind of global attention and global pressure mattered, and it was hugely, hugely significant. So that was a really important element of the campaign from an international perspective. I do think that the international significance of the referendum, it's not really for us to say, I suppose, what that was, but it became very clear to us within days of the referendum. I remember getting a message from a colleague who many on the call will know, Elisa, who sent me a message to say that she was at a workshop of reproductive rights activists in Tanzania when the result was announced, and how the cheer went up and how encouraged and how bolstered people were as a result of the referendum result. These victories matter. And actually they matter in places where people think they might be improbable. And I think that's because we're right. You know, I mean, it's that simple. When we present arguments that are grounded in human rights, it's not that we're self-righteous, it's that those arguments are right. We're arguing for dignity, for people's rights, for compassion, for equality, for decency. We're essentially saying to some, you know, on this referendum, for instance, what we were saying to people in Ireland was, at moments of crisis or tragedy, how do we want to treat each other? Do we want to hold our arms out to each other and wrap our arms around each other and care for and provide for and support each other? Is that what we want to do? Is that who we are? Or do we want to push people away, push them out of the country, see them suffer appalling violations and cruelties? Do we want to do that? Of course we didn't want to do that. So, you know, for me, we can talk about this referendum as a human rights moment, and it absolutely was. But in you know, at the heart of it all, it was a moment that was about asking a society that had an appalling history since the foundation of our state, which is only 100 years old, of violating the sexual and reproductive rights of people in this country, particularly of women and girls, in really horrific ways, where we had worked over many years to reveal all of that. And collectively, society was owning that in a way that I don't think the political system understood. And we were saying to them, who are we now? And how will we care for each other? And I think if we make that argument clearly, if we present this clearly, then, you know, we will get the right response. We will win because we're right.
Totalmente. Bueno, ya son las casi.
Totally. So it's almost 6:30 p.m., 11:30 p.m. in Ireland, I believe. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Are you 10:30 p.m.? 10:30, okay. Sometimes it's a 5, other times it's a 4-hour difference. Okay. So I'm so thankful. All of us are very thankful. It's been a pleasure to have this discussion with dear colleagues. For me, it's a great pleasure, and I'm really happy that we are Amnesty International, and we are speaking of these matters at such a top level. We have lots of fruit for thought now. You've contributed with plenty to trigger actions against the conservative backlash, and we've inspired us to collaborate in new ways, for example, with the US and in Ireland. So Tarah, of course, you know, you can count with our full support from Argentina in anything you might need to make sure that the US doesn't take a step back, because the US for our region really means a lot. So we need to post on the New York Times. The world is watching, definitely. We'll do our best from here to support you. I'm very thankful to you all for your willingness to contribute. We'll present a report in English and Spanish from this session, so you can share it back with your sections. Jaime will share that with you too. The recordings will be made available for your sections and Jaime in your academic world. Warm greetings to you all. Thanks again, and see you soon.
Adiós.